Welcome everybody here with us in presence in the room, and for those of you who are joining us online via the live stream, welcome also. For those watching not here, online, the last time that we met, so to speak, was yesterday evening during our opening plenary. We were joined by Commissioner Bankole, also State Secretary Morgan, and Deputy Secretary General of the EAS, Helene Koenig. We have since then conducted very, very intensive, very rich consultations in a closed format, in a Chatham House format. And what I had promised to do yesterday at my introduction was share a little bit about what that focus was going to be on. After that, I'd like to turn to Commissioner Bankole and also to our dear friend, the EU Ambassador to the African Union, Birgitte, to hear some of your reflections, and then I'll wrap up. Yesterday, in my opening remarks, we touched on what we thought were the issues behind the issues in the Africa-Europe relationship, and I listed 4 of them. Those are the things that we took up today in our closed consultations, and let me just say a short word about them. We touched on interests as very important. And interests we thought were important because changes in global developments and changes in the global order are creating new interests. To give an example of changes in global developments, I mentioned how we in Europe are moving very strongly in the direction of renewable energy. That creates massive new appetite in Europe, but also in the world, for the kinds of critical resource materials and green energy that Africa is very rich in. That changes an element of the relationship from something important for Europe and Africa to something essential or even existential. And when we talk about the changing global order, it's also incredibly important that we in Europe, speaking from a European perspective, ensure that our relationships with the rest of the world and with our closest neighbors in Africa are as strong and robust as they can be. Because it's an uncertain world ahead, and it's going to be incredibly critical that we have the best of friends and the strongest of relationships everywhere possible. We touched second on the issue of values and principles. And this is an area where there's a lot of commonality, but there is also a bit of dissonance and friction. The thinking here is that while Europeans have seen their values in the fullest interpretation of them as something universal, sometimes they're experienced as a product of European power by our partners. And that's a very important distinction. And we thought it was an important discussion to have, to test this thesis about universality and about them being actually an expression of a strong position of power that Europe enjoyed. The second aspect of that sort of dyad is principles. And principles here come back to sort of the fundamental rules of the global order. And here we have, we think, very much shared principles that resonate in Africa. Sovereignty, territorial integrity are some of the key things that we hear from Africa as being central to them as well. But there's also the sense that in our more recent history, we come back to this post-1989 moment, that maybe we took some liberties with those principles. And that's something that we hear quite often, that things that we did in the interest of values, or we felt that we needed to do in the interest of values, were seen by our partners as being a contravention of those principles. So this is something that we felt is an issue behind an issue that we need to close the gap on. We touched also on the tension between competition and some degree of exclusivity. We felt, again, this is an issue that plays out across Europe's new developing interest in Africa, which will involve new levels of investment, new levels of seriousness on the European side. But we have to recognize that Africa is also pursuing, as it should, the partnerships that it can with a whole spectrum of actors. The issue comes to a crux when a degree of exclusivity comes in. And if we bring this to a little bit more of a specific place, there are certain kinds of investment which Africa absolutely needs. Let's look in the digital space, the digital and tech space, which have been filled by powerful international actors. And the feeling sometimes on Europe's part is that's a choice that Africa makes that has certain consequences for Europe. If you go with one partner, you may lose the other one. And this is something I think that we need to discuss a little bit further to come up with a kind of clear idea about what the trade-offs are and whether there's also the possibility to make this not zero-sum, it's not one or the other, but look for areas of confluence. And finally, the fourth topic, and I'll stop there, is on multilateralism. It's beyond dispute, I think, for everybody in our discussions here and who is assembled here, that Africa deserves a greater voice on the world stage. Nobody is questioning that. We were trying to look beyond that at what Africa's role would be when it has this space. And one of the challenges that we put out there in our discussion was for Africa to be thinking in a global way itself. Now, you could say that reverses the sequence and the natural order of things, that Africa should be given its rightful share of a role on the world stage. That could be in the Security Council and other formats as well. And that's correct, of course. Nobody's disputing it. But it's also a very interesting thought exercise to talk and to think with Africa about what its views would be, not simply on African issues that are coming from the international order to it, but Africa's views on global issues. That would really be a change in paradigm and a change in thought. And it could be something that gets us closer to these concrete changes that we're looking at. Let us hear from Africa on that. So those were the four things that we began with. But you won't be surprised that the conversation and exchange took on a dynamic of its own. It was greatly enriched. New topics came to it. And I'd be really fascinated now to hear what two of our participants, our leading participants, made of that. So if I could, Commissioner Bankole, could I turn to you first for some reflections? Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I think we've had a very engaging forum, and I really want to again thank the European Council on Foreign Relations for putting this together. I think I like the coziness of the numbers and gives us a lot of depth. But as per my observation, this session reminds me, or this whole forum reminds me of The Economist, 1990s. It says, the hopeless continent as headline. A few years later, The Economist changed and said, Africa rising. And later on, it said, Africa aspiring. That is the fact. Hopeless in the 1990s because of military dictatorships, because of gross abuse of human rights, because of genocide in Rwanda with the world watching, doing nothing, and so on and so forth. But today, I believe we're here not just because Ukraine is a factor, it's because Africa matters. It matters to Europe, it matters to the rest of the world. And the voice of Africa is getting louder and louder. We are not yet there. It's not yet a uhuru, but we are getting there. But given that space, what do we really take away from here? Given the hopeless continent that the economists referred to about 2 decades ago, we have what I call a hangover of history, a history of exclusion, a history of servitude, a history of colonialism, of apartheid that did not really go well for any order, which Africa was not fully part of, but was tagging along. Now, we're no longer going to be tagging along. We want to have a seat at the table that is adequate and effective. And we know it's not going to be given to us. We are going to demand our rights because it matters for Africa to be a continent of consequence. So that brings me to what I call a partnership of consequence. Yesterday we had a partnership of choice. A partnership of consequence, meaning that when the partnership is going the other way around, we will let our partners know that this is not fair, this is not justifiable, this is not in Africa's interest. And I think that is why yesterday we have continued to probe. And my point is, who is going to build this new world order? We have to build together. We know it's emerging, as you said, it's changing. The world is changing. So is Africa, transforming practically in all areas. Indeed, a former vice president of the World Bank once said, if your company does not have an African strategy, then it's not a future. It's not a corporate body with the future. Africa is the future, and we have to accept that. This is very, very critical for us and going forward. Then I go to my third point, which is around basically the remaking of that order. And it can only happen when we continue to speak to each other, to listen to each other. As I've repeated many times, we need to leverage the goodwill in Europe. But Europe also must leverage the good resources on the continent. We have to keep engaging, knowing that the world is one, and we are part of that. Yes, we had the shared values, we had engagement on the multilateral system, which has continued to be up and down depending on whose interest is God. But the most important thing is we have the need for a United Nations Security Council that is inclusive, legitimate, democratic, as necessary, and reflective of today's world. And African interests are also global, even though they are specific to the African world. So how do we build this new multilateral system that we all aspire? From trade to digital transformation, of course, to political inclusion. Women, the youth, children affected by armed conflict, all have a role to play. And I think these are some of my reflections, and I really want to assure you that we will not rest as African Union to be the great defender of Africa, the great defender of a rules-based order, the gladiator for peace and security. I thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Eloquent as always. Birgitte.
Yes, thank you very much. And also from my side, thank you very much for the whole organizations, for colleagues who are here in the room, colleagues who are following us online. I would like to touch upon, just share with you first 5 of the objectives I came with. And then share with you the first or some ideas for a list, perhaps of some 10 points that I would like to work with, at least where I come from, and I have a few input to that. But I think maybe building on what was said, obviously, both by the Commissioner. Commissioner, you talked about the front pages of a continent in crisis and moving towards aspirations. I would like us to take us also to today. Where the front pages are different. And so I came here, and we've had discussions before coming here to look at the EU-Africa partnership in a broader context, in a global context. And I think that's been very rewarding, because we all know, I'll come back to that we have very, very different situations on especially the European continent. And my second point was, yes, there is crisis, and that brings an openness to discuss opportunities. And I think as diplomats, we know that. And that's also why the timing is right. My third was, European Union are totally behind what the Commissioner said in terms of a united African voice, taking it to the international scene. I think that's extremely important, and I'll come back to, of course, elaborating on that. For the European Union, the fourth point I want to stress is a rule-based order. It's really, being a multilateral organization, this is extremely important that we have some shared values enshrined in whatever we call it. Call it order, we call it multilateralism. And my last thing is that brings us to a moment where we should be open to refine the systems and this global picture. What have I picked up during the discussions that have been really very, very interesting? First one is, in this group, what I've heard times and over again is the word for multilateralism, for working together, working jointly. And I think that's extremely important. That will be on my own points, 10 points list, the first one that I've seen that. The second point is a very interesting discussion on the process for decision makings on both Africa and in Europe. They're different, but processes for decision making is processes for how do we actually discuss and process our interests and values. So I think that's extremely important that we look at that. It would be, as a commissioner was saying, we would support AU or an African member state in the UN Security Council. What type of preparations, what difference would that make? It would definitely make a difference, I'm no doubt. But the whole issue of how you prepare this, the same thing for G20 in terms of the world economy, how do you build African interest there? My third point that I have picked up is something that comes up again and again. I have the privilege of living at the African continent. I've lived there for many years, and the issue of colonial history and the importance of our history, that we still discuss this, we still bring it to the table because it's still there. And it's something that we as Europeans, we have to think about and also internalize in our different work with African Union and African member states. My fourth point is very much, I think we all discussed a lot values and interest, and what's the difference? The good thing is, I think, over the last 1.5 days, what I've seen is we share a lot of values. You, Theo, hinted also, but also Commissioner, relations to respect for sovereignty, and which is an important. That does not mean that we don't come with different interests, and I think that has been quite important to make that distinction. And I think we have to be open towards that discussion. My last point, and there I would like to refer again to the Commissioner who says, an organization that doesn't have a strategy for Africa is not up to beat and up to speed. I would like to say then, and I know that the African Union is working on a strategy also, are you then, I think as being a European, it would be good to see an African continent, African Union, in whatever shapes it takes, having a strategy on its cooperation with the EU and with Europe. I think that would be extremely important. We had some good discussions of what that type of strategy, what I picked up. There are some institutional reforms that we've been discussing. And then what I also picked up was what we call now the 3 Cs, and that's where I will end, in terms of looking jointly at climate change, looking at the issue of the COVID, the corona, economic recovery, and then the crisis. That's the last C, because I started saying that we are here because we're in a broader perspective, the world has changed. We have a war at the European continent, but I also want to say, and we work closely with many African partners, unfortunately also on conflicts on the African continent because they have been on the rise. I'll end there, but I think it's really a good start, and I look forward to finish my 10 points. And here was the 5, or at least the contours of the 5. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Birgitte. Thank you, Commissioner. We're at the closing here. Let me say one word about the way forward. We came together. This was the inaugural meeting of the Berlin Africa Forum. We promised that inaugural meant that we will continue, that further meetings will take place in Africa and Europe on a rotating basis. We came together under the rubric of exchanging views of Africa and Europe in the new global order. So I'd like to propose that the way forward for us is to move from views to agenda setting. And when I hear the excellent points made by the Commissioner, the points that you've come up with, Birgitte, it starts to sound to me like this is something that we need to collect and turn into an agenda for work. So what I would propose very much is that what we continue to do in this format, this Berlin Africa format, is turn this into an agenda for Africa, Europe in the new global order. What are the things that we need to work on? Let's put them down. Let's turn that into a body of work and go after it so that we can really realize this aspiration that's been articulated by both sides, that actually the two can and should be very much partners in this uncertain world that lies ahead. That's what I would propose that this group continue to work with. That's what I feel passionate about as ECFR, and I hope that you would join us as we continue to convene around that and work with us in that same kind of partnership sense. With that, we are at the close of this inaugural session, the Berlin Africa Forum. I've thanked you yesterday for traveling from very far, some of you traveling from less far, but we're equally grateful. Thank you for the trust and the support, for the contributions, but most of all, for the frankness. We discussed under Chatham House, so they would be frank, but you really gave and spoke sincerely and honestly about what you were thinking. And that's the only way that we're going to be able to advance. So I'm incredibly thrilled and honored that this group has chosen to trust us and to work with us in this format. And I look forward to working with you going forward. Thank you very much.